Good evening, everyone, or good morning, depending on your time zone. Welcome to Perspectives on Peace, the first of this year's Kishore Mahbubani speaker series. My name is Nick Alchin. I'm the head of UWCSEA East Campus, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our auditorium tonight, where we have a carefully screened and selected group of teachers and students, live, in fact, a delight in these times. And it's a special occasion for at least three reasons. Firstly, it is the International Day of Peace and also UWC Day. What better occasion could there be to join a global conversation about peace? Secondly, we're delighted and honoured to be joined by Kishore Mahbubani himself, and for him to be speaking with our college president, Karma Elliott, and I'll introduce them formally in a moment. Thirdly, this is the opening event in our 50th year celebrations, our anniversary. We've come a long, long way, along with the rest of the world, since 1971, and we're looking forward to another 50 years in partnership with Singapore and with the United World College Movement, with colleges around the world. But despite all the changes, in these fast-moving times, one thing remains absolutely constant for us, which is our guiding mission to make education a force to unite peoples, nations, and cultures for peace and a sustainable future. Here at UWCSEA in our learning program, we think about peace in three ways. We think about personal peace, whereas we as individuals learn to accept ourselves, to know our strengths, to know our weaknesses, our preferences, our needs, and our own aspirations. Working on that ourselves and with our students leads to thinking about peace in our community, between people, between groups, between schools, within the school, between us and our host country, and a whole range of stakeholders. And if we and other parts of civil society and governments do this consistently, worldwide, across the globe, it contributes to global peace ultimately. And that was the vision of our founder, Kurt Hahn, all those years ago. And when we talk about global peace, we mean a positive peace. That is not just the absence of war, but the existence and pursuit of attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies by the removal of direct and indirect violence. So the conversation today will largely be looking at this latter idea, the way that attitudes, institutions, and structures support peace. It's an extremely timely conversation for obvious reasons. Just this weekend, news about the UK, Australian, French, US situation, for example, raises many, many interesting questions about so many issues. But above any specific example, there are perhaps three themes that you'll see emerging today. The first one is the changing rules and influence of the rules-based international order. That's been so successful in many decades, and it now seems to be facing challenges. The second theme is the global response to the rise of China, seen perhaps through the lenses of confront and concede, or engagement and isolation. The third theme may be the role of one particular institution and one particular set of structures that's locally relevant for us, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in a post-pandemic future. A few weeks ago, ASEAN announced a partnership with Britain, the first nation to be accorded the privilege since China 25 years ago. What does this development tell us about ASEAN and the future of regionalism in a post-pandemic world when we get there? These are big ideas, and they are tightly related to the peace aspect of our mission. So we're honoured and privileged to have two eminently qualified people to discuss them, Kishore Mahbubani and Karma Elliott. Kishore Mahbubani is currently Distinguished Fellow, Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. He's had two distinguished careers in diplomacy and academia, and he's a prolific writer who's spoken in many corners of the world. In diplomacy, he was with the Singapore Foreign Service for 33 years, twice as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, and twice as president of the UN Security Council. He was also permanent secretary to the Foreign Ministry and was conferred the Public Administration Medal, Gold Medal, by the Singapore government in 1998. In academia, he was founding dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and professor of the practice of public policy. Elected as an honorary member to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he was honored as a distinguished thinker and placed in the company of several of America's founding fathers, who've also been honored that way. The institution has been going since 1780, and Kishore joined them. As a prolific author, having published 8 books, he's written about geopolitics and particularly Asian and ASEAN culture. His 2 children are SCA alumni, and Mr. Mahbubani served as chair of the board when the decision was taken to expand SCA to grow East Campus. The speaker series and the Kishore Mahbubani Library downstairs were named in honor of his tremendous contribution. Karma Elliott joined UWCSCA in August 2019 as our first college president. A career British diplomat for 23 years, until 2010, Karma worked on a wide variety of roles across the world and as Consul General in Chongqing, Jeddah and Shanghai. Karma spent much of her adult life in China as a student and also as Executive Director at China's single largest international NGO, the Half the Sky Foundation, focused on enriching the lives of China's orphaned children, before joining the British Council as Director of China and concurrently Minister for Culture and Education in the British Embassy in Beijing. Throughout her professional life, Karma's worked for meaningful change in the government, in international education and development sectors, and in doing so developed a deep knowledge of the cultural nuances required to successfully navigate and create intercultural understanding and appreciate the importance of respecting diverse perspectives. Karma's been honoured twice by Her Majesty the Queen for her service to the UK and abroad. She's single with 2 adopted daughters. I hand to Karma and Kishore for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
So that was a very extensive introduction, and I'm humbled that you agreed to join me here tonight, Kishore, for a conversation. That was a wonderful expose, both of your previous but also your current roles and your commitment to continuing public service on behalf of Singapore, here in Singapore, but also with a global perspective as well. I'm also humbled that one of the things that Nick didn't mention there, but we are also here to celebrate tonight, is the partnership between the Asian Peace Institute and UWC-SEA. And in our 50th anniversary year, we've agreed to work together with a fellow in your institute, looking at how we capture the voice of youth in peace and in the conversations about peace and conflict in the world, with things like an essay competition that we've been discussing and so on. So that's a fantastic, the extension of your connection here to the college, and with the ambition that in future we would do more together as well. So we thank you very much, and we're very humbled by the fact that you agreed that we were a suitable partner for this work with you as well. I also know, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind saying a few words about it. Nick mentioned your 2 children were graduates from the college, and that both were involved in the Initiative for Peace here in the college in its early days during their time in the college. And I know you've told me a little bit, but I wonder if you could share with our current students and parents who are with us today a little bit about that and bring that to life for them as well.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We can, thank you.
Okay, good. I want to begin by saying it's such a pleasure to be back here in the, I guess you call it the United World College Southeast Asia family.
Yes.
And I truly enjoyed my time as chairman of the board. And it was actually very inspiring to learn about the ideals about the United World College movement. And it's quite remarkable what it has done over the years globally, and certainly what it has done in Singapore. And the fact that the Singapore government actually allowed the campus to be doubled was an indication that they really appreciated the contributions of the school to Singapore and to its role in the world also. And you spoke about my two children, my daughter Sheila and my younger son Jamat, studied in United College, of course in the Dover campus, because this campus hadn't been built by then. And but I want to tell a slightly funny story.
Please. Will.
About the first time I brought my younger son Jamat here, must have been 10 years ago, I suspect, I'm not sure. And when he walked into the campus, this campus, he looked up and suddenly he saw the Kishore Mahbubani library. He looked at it, he was very surprised, and he said, "Dad, you're not dead yet. How can we live a life here after you?" So the honesty of young people is very inspiring. But both Sheila and Jamat had a very good time in the school, and as part of the peace initiative that they were involved in, Sheila went to Sri Lanka, which, as you know, was recovering. In fact, she was going through an interim period between two bad phases in the war. And my younger son Jamat went to Cambodia to help do some rebuilding, in the rural areas. So they both participated in the peace initiatives. But I'm also glad you mentioned this new partnership that the UWCSEA is setting up with the Asian Peace Program that I've launched at the Asian Research Institute. And we share common goals to try and bring about peace in the world. And the paradox about our times is that on the one hand, we live in the most peaceful era ever in human history. I mean, this is statistically speaking. In terms of number of people dying from interstate wars, is the lowest it has ever been, and this has been documented in great detail by a Harvard professor called Steven Pinker. And if the students haven't heard of Steven Pinker, I strongly recommend him to them, because they will find he's done an amazing job of collecting all the data in this area. So on the one hand, we live in the most peaceful era in human history. On the other hand, we are also about to enter one of the most dangerous periods in human history, because the prospects of a nuclear war, and a nuclear war, of course, is something that the world actually has never experienced. We've had 2 bombs that were dropped in Japan after World War II, and we saw how much devastation they did. But in a nuclear war, let's say the one that could happen is one between China and the United States. United States would lose 10 to 15 cities, at least. China would lose more than double the number of cities. Millions would die. In theory, such a horrible outcome, the prospect should be 0, but they're not 0. And that's why I think it's very important for us to understand what leads to wars and what do we do to prevent wars from happening. Because peace is a bit like the oxygen in this room. All of us are breathing it, but we don't notice it. We'll only notice it when someone sucks away the oxygen in the room. So in the case of peace too, once it's sucked away, and when war breaks out, then you realize how amazing peace is. You only notice it when it goes away.
And so just in the last week alone, as Nick also mentioned, there are a lot of shifting sands and shifting alliances in the world now. And there was mention of, what the UK is doing in this region, greater references to the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia-Pacific region. And that seems to be also stimulating instability on the Korean peninsula as well. And notice that Kim Jong-un also referred to the prospect for nuclear war as well, and has been firing missiles again, as has South Korea. So where do you think, you mentioned possible tensions between the US and China. What do you think are the key sort of areas of tension between them that might lead to such a standoff? Hopefully nothing, nothing concrete, but the standoff, is it around Taiwan? Is it around just the rising superpower and that China represents? What is it that you feel made you reference that particular relationship as being one of the big risk areas?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Karma, that there are many, many geopolitical flashpoints. And sadly, they're all in our region. Because the prospects of war between any two European states today is zero. I mean, unfortunately, UK and France will never go to war.
No, well,
I mean, they may insult each other, they may say, you stabbed me in the back, but they won't go to war with each other.
Yeah,
there'll be zero chance of war between UK and France, UK and Germany, Germany and France, and so on and so forth. And frankly, zero prospect of war between the United States and Canada, or even, frankly, in South America, in most of Africa or so, you won't see major interstate wars. But paradoxically, most of the most dangerous places where you can get a big wars, like the ones between India and Pakistan, or between China and Vietnam, or between China and the US, will take place in our region. But of all these flashpoints, I mean, you mentioned Korea, but you will see lots of missiles being fired in what he calls to get attention by North Korea, but there'll be no war in the Korean Peninsula, because both sides understand the stakes very, very clearly. And whereas by contrast, the place that is becoming the most dangerous place in the world is Taiwan. And what most people in the world are not aware of is that the last 10 months of 2020 were actually very, very dangerous, because what kept peace on Taiwan Straits was the agreement between US and China on the One China policy, whereby the United States would maintain official ties with Beijing and unofficial ties with Taiwan. And this was part of what they call the One China policy. So as long as everyone's stuck to that policy, no dangers. But when Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, tried to change it and say, why can't we have official relations with Taiwan? And the minute he started to weaken the One China policy, that's when the prospects of war went up dramatically, because no Chinese leader can accept Taiwan becoming independent. So the danger of a war starting accidentally went up dramatically. And you saw what's been revealed in this book by Bob Woodward, which is, if it is true, is actually quite stunning, that the head of the US military's chief of defense forces called his counterpart in China to say, please let me assure you that even if President Donald Trump orders me to launch a nuclear strike against China, I will not do so. Now for him to do that showed that he was aware that this could happen, And the fact that he thought that a nuclear war could happen should be a major wake-up call for all of us. And so we need to pull back from that dangerous point.
So when you said that, that a war in the South China Seas, or between China and Taiwan, or China and the US with Taiwan in the middle, could start accidentally, what did you mean by that? That, are we getting the politicians that we deserve or need, who understand enough about the nuance of how these policies have been developed to actually deal with them in the modern age, when they've got the toys to do the wrong thing as much as the right thing?
Well, I would say South China Sea, I don't worry that much. Frankly, in the South China Sea, there'll be maneuvers, but there might even be a skirmish, but there'll be no war. I mean, major war. Because there's room for flexibility in that area, right? There's no room for flexibility on Taiwan. Zero flexibility. Because the Chinese, as you know this better than I do, Karma, for them, the century of humiliation, 1842 to 1949, is like yesterday. You know, from the seizure of Hong Kong in the First Opium War to the loss to the Japan, the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, which led to Taiwan being seceded for the first time, as you know. So all these memories of the century of humiliation, most of them have gone away except for one, which is Taiwan. And there is a total unanimity of views in China that at some point in time there must be a reunification within Taiwan and China. The best case outcome is some kind of peaceful reunification, or even something where you postpone the current situation and let the status quo remain, where the people of Taiwan are at peace. And the people of Taiwan enjoy a wonderful life, by the way. I love Taiwan. I've been there many times.
I'm quite fond of it myself.
I've been there many times, and it's a wonderful place,
Yeah.
and people are very happy and doing very well. So don't disrupt the status quo. But this is why when Mike Pompeo said, hey, we're going to try and establish official relations with Taiwan, that's where he didn't realize that he was crossing a Chinese red line, and therefore could have triggered a very strong military response from China. And the military response would have come because the Chinese leaders cannot afford to be seen to be weak on the Taiwan issue. Their hands are actually tied. And what the good news, by the way, is that the Biden administration that has come in since January understands that. And if you notice that every Biden administration official, without fail, I heard the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, speak at Fullerton Hotel when he was here a couple of months ago. He reiterated the Biden administration stands by the one China policy. And as long as the US keeps saying that, then there'll be no nuclear war.
Okay. Well, that's mildly reassuring, I would say, but good to have your view on that. So, could I take you back to your time in the United Nations and what the United Nations embodies as, perhaps the ultimate embodiment of, the post-world, post-Second World War order, and as a body to bring nations together to create greater understanding and therefore build trust between nations as well, which are fundamentally part of the core to our own mission as well. And those rules and orders that were established in that time, now 80 years later, it's difficult to believe it's 80 years since then, but a lot has happened since then, of course, and there's so much challenge now to, doesn't matter where you are in the world, to those established orders. Some of it through, I think, direct provocation, some of it, I think, through omission or lack of understanding of why those rules and orders are in place. What do you think that the United Nations General Assembly is happening this week? There's still a lot to do on the United Nations to-do list in terms of some of the things that it's taken on, some of the commitments made through those vehicles with the SDGs and the sort of trajectory to 2030 and whether we're going to achieve some of the goals we've set ourselves, not least with climate change, the crisis around climate change, and the intersection with so many other issues as well. Do you feel that with some of the challenges to the UN and its funding, its composition, the way it works, some of the challenges we've seen recently with the breakdown of everything in Afghanistan and so on, do you feel that the United Nations now is fit for purpose and will be able to respond in the way that the world needs, that our youth need, to be able to rely on systems which help us to deconflict situations as much as create the peaceful conditions in the first place?
Well, as you know, I was ambassador to the UN twice. And fortunately or unfortunately, I fell in love with the United Nations. And I know in many parts of the world, in many sectors, it's not fashionable to love the UN. But I'm a great believer in the United Nations, and I think the UN Charter is one of the most beautiful documents ever written in human history. And if we could obey its principles, I think the world would definitely be a much safer place. And as you know, the opening lines of the UN Charter declare that its mission is to save mankind, from the scourge of war. And to that extent, it has succeeded because it has prevented World War III. So let's be clear in terms of its core mission. Since we are talking about peace today, it has succeeded in preventing a World War III, because when the statesmen who wrote the UN Charter, they had lived through World War I, they had lived through World War II, and they said, let's not have a World War III. And they succeeded in that sense. So that people, all the people who rubbish the UN don't understand what a difference is made in human history. And I earlier mentioned Steven Pinker describing how we now live in one of the most peaceful eras in human history, where we no longer have the reflex which we had even in the first half of the 20th century. Whenever countries had problems, they immediately would go to war, right? I mean, whether Japan and China, Japan and Korea, Germany and France, UK and Germany, you see, you all went to war all the time. And that now we don't. Why? Because the UN Charter changed the course of human history. So let's be very clear that the United Nations has made a profound impact on human history. But at the same time, its reputation and standing has gone down. And that's primarily because the world's number one power, the United States, for a complex variety of reasons, has decided that a strong United Nations is not in American interest. And if I had any doubt about it, it was removed when I had a bus ride at a conference with a gentleman who was almost like the Director of National Intelligence of the United States, a former Director of National Intelligence. And I had just given a speech praising the UN, and he said to me very categorically, he said, Kishore, I can understand why you, coming from Singapore, like the United Nations, because the United Nations enhances the power and influence of small states like Singapore, which is true, it does. We can go to the UN, we can put forward a case, and we can get influence in the world. But he says, from the point of the United States, the United Nations is a constraint on us, you know. United States wants to have the ability to act freely as a great power, and United Nations keeps getting in the way because it has rules that say you cannot start wars. And as you know, I mean, this is a fact. The United States has got involved in some wars which are technically illegal under international law, which Kofi Annan said about the Iraq war in 2003. And it's international because, it's illegal because under international law, you can only go to war if it's either an act of self-defense or if it's endorsed by the UN Security Council. So the invasion of Iraq was neither an act of self-defense nor endorsed by the UN Security Council. So therefore, it was an illegal war. But it's illegal because you have the United Nations Charter that says it's illegal. So that's why the UN plays a very important role. And I've written a book about this, as you know, The Great Convergence. And I begin the book by actually citing a speech that Bill Clinton gave in 2003, the former president. And in that speech, Bill Clinton says, and this is a very wise advice he gave to his fellow Americans. Bill Clinton said, if the US is going to be number one forever, then fine. We can keep on doing what we were doing. We're number one. But Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if we can conceive of a world where the United States is no longer number one, then it is in the United States' national interest to strengthen multilateral rules, partnerships, institutions, and so on and so forth. So Bill Clinton was saying that the United States should switch its policy away from weakening the UN to strengthening the UN. And what he said implicitly was That's our best way to constrain the next great power, which is China. He never mentioned China, of course, but that was his hidden agenda.
Yes.
So you can see, therefore, I've been arguing that the United States should stop its policy of weakening the UN and realize that you can only appeal to self-interest. I want to appeal to the United States to say it is in your national interest now to strengthen the UN. And if you can persuade the United States to do so, then the whole world would change dramatically.
So perhaps if we move on to then talking about the rise of China and the challenge that presents, do you think that America is yet able to conceive of that world that Bill Clinton urged almost, I guess, 20 years ago now? Do you think the current administration is looking at China in that way, as a partner under a rules-based system? Or, do you think that China wants to be considered in that way? Is China in a position where it feels actually it's strong enough now to make those rules for the world, and actually that it's for the world to listen to what China wants now?
Well, as you know, I've written another book
Yes. Thankfully you
on
have.
US-China relations. My latest one has China won, and which unfortunately says on page one of the book, it says the US-China geopolitical contest was launched by Donald Trump, but it will outlast Trump. Unfortunately, Biden proved me correct. He continued it. Even Biden and Trump disagreed on everything except on China. So there is obviously a bipartisan consensus in the United States on China. And as I explain in my book, what the US is doing is rational behavior of superpower. No superpower ever gives up its number one status willingly, never. He'll fight to maintain it as long as possible. So sometime in the next 10 to 15 years, China's economy will become number one, and United States, for the first time in 130, 140 years, will become the number two economic power in the world. Now, that will be a huge shock for the United States. And so when the United States is going all out to stop the rise of China, that is normal behavior. We should expect it. That's what happens for thousands of years of history. But of course, we hope that the contest will be played out peacefully and not in the form of a major war between the two sides. And that's what... Does that sound?
I think maybe your microphone touched your neck there. Yeah.
Sorry, I should bring the mic down a bit lower.
You're good.
Okay. And I think we can prevent a war between US and China, but it requires a process, a very complex process of them talking to each other regularly so that they understand clearly where each other's red lines are. And that, unfortunately, is not happening now. So on US and China, I'm actually somewhat, what I think on Taiwan, they have receded. The danger of a nuclear war has receded. The overall relationship remains very difficult. And just today, a friend of mine in Washington, D.C. sent me a message. He's a very seasoned observer of Washington, D.C. He said, Kishore, the mood in Washington, D.C. today is so anti-China that if Biden gives any hint that he's going to be soft or flexible on China, he'll be killed. So this is an example of how difficult it is to get peace in the world, because countries get locked into positions. And in the United States today, it's politically impossible for any of the politicians to stand up and say, hey, why don't we reboot and consider a different policy towards China? That's impossible.
And I'm going to ask you to take out your crystal ball. So having looked back and your view of the United Nations based on your own experiences there and your real love for the institution and what it does and what it can do. I'm going to ask you to think about what China is currently projecting and whether you think that some of the most recent announcements from President Xi, the crackdowns that we're starting to hear about, not least on the human rights front, and I think it would be good to have some questions perhaps on some of the challenges that there are in addressing real concerns about human rights in a country that is so closed to outside influence in that area. But if I look at some of the things that President Xi has recently announced, you've got a raft of measures over the last 2 or 3 years, from the social credit system and the controls inherent in that. You've got a real, crackdown on feminism in China, where issues around gender diversity and the role of women in the economy have also been impacted. It's something I spent quite a lot of time looking at. But also most recently, the announcement about the control on tech firms and their ability to run their businesses without further state control. Now a crackdown, it would seem, on international education and the influence of that as well, crackdown on English and the teaching of English. Do you think that we are looking at a new cultural revolution, that's where Xi Jinping is going, that only through that very coercive control does he feel that he can be that president for life that he's signalling? Is that coming? Should we be scared of that?
Well, I would say that on the subject you just raised, is there a cultural revolution taking place or coming back to China? I can say confidently that there are 2 schools of thought. The first school of thought, I would say, is what you will find in the Anglo-Saxon media, that this is clearly Xi Jinping going back to the ideological roots of the Chinese Communist Party and saying the time has come now, China is rich enough, now we can go back to socialism, we're going to crack down on these big firms, big tech, and now focus on redistributing the pie. And as you know, the phrase used is common prosperity, and let's take care of people at the bottom, and so on and so forth. So, and if that happens, of course, if indeed he's cracking down on industries and big tech and big money and all that, then you could see, in a sense, in theory, a retreat from capitalism. People will stop investing in China, and frankly, the Chinese economy will collapse. Okay, so that's school number 1. And I would say it is, I don't rule it out completely, I don't say it's there's a zero prospect of that happening, But there is another school of thought that says that actually Xi Jinping appreciates what China has accomplished under the free market system. Its economy has grown faster than any other countries in the last 30 years, right? I mean, just imagine that in purchasing power parity terms, China's GNP was 10% of the United States in 1980. 2014, it became bigger in PPP terms. In nominal market terms, the US GNP was 8 times the size of China's. Now it's only 1.5 times larger. So this had a tremendous track record. But he thinks that at this point in time, there have also been some excesses have developed. Excesses have developed in the sense of the big firms becoming too large and monopolistic and trying to control the regulators in the same way that big tech in the United States controls the regulators in Washington, D.C. So as you know, in my book, I have a chapter on how the United States has become functionally a plutocracy, which is a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And Xi Jinping is saying, I do not want a plutocracy in China, and I'd rather that we break down the power of these large monopolistic giants. And that's what he's doing. And if that's what he's doing, paradoxically, he may actually unleash entrepreneurial energy by restricting the power of the big tech. Because today, and in fact there was an article in the Financial Times today, if I'm not mistaken, saying that the big tech in the US is so successful, every time a potential competitor emerges, they gobble it up before it can become big enough to be a threat. And there's a guy who's a real expert on artificial intelligence. He's one of the biggest investors in artificial intelligence. He's written one of the definitive books on it. His name is Lee Kai-Fu. And I heard him speak at an interview with The Economist. And in the interview, he's invested in 1,000 startups in China. He says all these new moves make it easier for his startups to succeed because they can no longer be eaten up by the giants. So paradoxically, even though in theory Xi Jinping is cracking down on big tech, actually he may be unleashing entrepreneurial energy. Now, frankly, which school of thought is correct? Is Xi Jinping destroying capitalism in China, or is Xi Jinping rejuvenating capitalism in China? The two schools of thought. We'll find out within 10 years. But I, as a betting man, I place my bets on the second school of thought.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have to say I agree with you, and I'd highly recommend for those who haven't read Kai-Fu Lee's books as well. Very much worth reading. He used to work for Google, of course, so he knows all about big firms that gobble up the small firms. So I think he's now joined the other side, as it were. But his advice on what is happening in China, I think, is spot on, potentially. So I would like to ask you, I know we're going to move on to questions from the audience shortly, but I would like to just turn to, as Nick said, we'd like to talk about ASEAN as the United World College of Southeast Asia, and in celebrating our 50 years. The original founding documents talked very much about the role of Singapore within Southeast Asia, and a real desire, to as a school and as a college, with the support of the then Prime Minister who opened the college, for this to be a beacon for education in the region, but also, to attract scholars from the other countries of ASEAN in order to be a good friend to some of the challenges around development in other parts of the region as well. And we're seeing, as we've already touched upon, a real growth in sort of region, in this region of sort of the different regional bodies, different alliances forming. Most recently, we've had the UK joining as a partner with ASEAN following China 25 years ago. What role do you see for Singapore as a traditional bridge in some of those relationships, as those traditional bodies change, as they start to look for partnerships elsewhere in the world themselves, as the bodies themselves are having to balance out perhaps some of the competing interests within and without? What role do you think that Singapore will continue to play
in ASEAN?
Yes, in ASEAN.
Well, first of all, let me begin. I may come across as being a very sentimental guy. I told you I love the United Nations. I love ASEAN equally passionately.
We need a positive view of peace. Yeah.
Genuinely, I think ASEAN, as you know, I wrote a book called the ASEAN, co-authored a book called the ASEAN Miracle, and ASEAN is a miracle. And I'll tell you why, because no other region of planet Earth is as diverse as Southeast Asia is. Actually, Southeast Asia is one of the most interesting human laboratories on planet Earth. Out of 650 million people in ASEAN, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists. You have Mahayana Buddhists, you have Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, you have communists. It's amazingly diverse, okay, as a region. And everyone predicted, including, as you know, various British historians, that Southeast Asia would become the Balkans of Asia, with wars starting within many countries. And there were wars between Southeast Asian countries. So what's amazing is that Southeast Asia has emerged as the second most peaceful corner of planet Earth after the European Union, right? Where we don't have zero prospect of war like the European Union, but we have zero wars. And that's amazing in such a diverse region. And this is one of the most underappreciated success stories, peace stories in the world, and that is ASEAN. And Singapore, as one of the smallest countries in Southeast Asia, cherishes this piece of Southeast Asia, and in fact tries very actively behind the scenes to play a role to keep Southeast Asia in the way that it is today. I mean, the whole story of how it came about is quite amazing. Because, for example, one thing that kept peace in Southeast Asia was a close relationship that was developed between the Prime Minister of Singapore then, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, and the President of Indonesia then, President Suharto. Now, I met both these men, and you cannot imagine two people who are more different in their outlook. Because Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was a trained Anglo-Saxon lawyer with a sharp, rigorous, analytical Western mind. President Suharto's mind was filled with Javanese mysticism, Javanese history, spoke very little English, and would behave very, very differently from how an Anglo-Saxon gentleman would behave. So when these two men formed this friendship, it was a remarkable development. But that showed how Southeast Asia is so amazing. People who are very different have learned to get along with each other. And therefore, what Southeast Asia has done is a model for, let's say, for South Asia, a model for India and Pakistan. It's a model for the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. Come and see how we get along in Southeast Asia. So really, therefore, the Southeast Asian story, I would say the United World College of Southeast Asia should try to sell the Southeast Asian story to the rest of the world too.
Well, we can work together on that, I think.
Sure.
And I was going to say to you, I hadn't really appreciated what you've just said around being a role model for other regions of the world which have had long-standing tensions as well, many of which not always based on religion, but where religion is a factor. And maybe sometime the ASEAN body will be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in the same way as the European Union was as well.
That was why I said in the conclusion of my book.
Yes, exactly.
ASEAN should be given a Nobel Peace Prize.
So maybe the college can get behind you, but we need more of those examples in order to build those partnerships for the future and around some of the big issues for the day. The big challenges are not going to solve themselves, and it needs fine minds from across regions to work together on them. That's very clear. I think it's probably about time for us to open up to questions.
Sure.
I've got many more questions, but I was enjoying listening to you, but I think we probably should let our audience ask those questions now. So over to Nick, who's going to coordinate.
Okay, thank you first of all, Kishore and Karma, for a phenomenally wide-ranging and fascinating talk. I'll open with one of the questions that's come through online, and then we'll follow up with some questions from the audience. And as I do so, because of the conditions, can I say that the microphone will be passed to you? Tina will hold the microphone for you. Please don't touch it, just so that we maintain strict as possible safety measures. One of the questions here you've addressed partially, but perhaps you could say a little bit more. How would you respond to some of the criticisms levied toward the UN regarding its ineffectiveness and inability to enforce its actions?
That's a very good question. And it's true that the United Nations is a very weak institution. But the United Nations is not weak by accident. It's weak by design. What do I mean weak by design? That the great powers, and this was especially, for example, true in the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union in the Cold War disagreed on everything. except one thing. They both wanted to keep the United Nations weak. And the way they kept the United Nations weak, you see, if you want to get things done, as you know, Nick, if you want to transform an organization, you want to make it strong, when you select the CEO, you will pick somebody who's dynamic, strong, driven, ambitious, out to change the world. Now, if you are dynamic, strong, ambitious, driven, out to change the world, you disqualify from becoming the UN Secretary General. Because the United States and Soviet Union both agreed, after the success of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was a very good UN Secretary General, that subsequently they picked weak, spineless candidates as UN Secretary General. For example, Kurt Waldheim of Austria. So, if you pick weak and spineless candidates as Secretary General, how do you expect the organization to deliver results? So, I think, therefore, the problem can be fixed very easily. From now on, they should say that if you're weak and spineless, you cannot become Secretary General of the UN.
I'm going to challenge you on that one. Do you think that Kofi Annan was weak and spineless?
Yeah, well, Kofi Annan was selected because they thought he was weak and spineless.
Okay.
And they made a mistake.
That's a fine,
So
fine-tuning that one.
No,
Yeah.
Kofi Annan was a very dear friend of mine. Very dear friend. I mean, really, we became very close. And he actually showed a tremendous amount of spine. And the sad part, this is a very sad story, because I knew him very well. When he stood up and said that the Iraq war was illegal, that took a tremendous amount of courage. But because he said that, the United States launched a vicious campaign to delegitimize him, and leaking all kinds of stories about the corruption of his son and so on and so forth. Because you leak stories to the media, and I know this for a fact, Kofi Annan became very depressed because he was attacked ruthlessly by Dick Cheney and his gangsters. So this is an example of someone they selected and they thought he was weak and spineless, but he turned out to be a really brave guy.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Moving on now to one specific question around one of the topics you've addressed, Kishore. You mentioned China's red lines when it comes to Taiwan. Well, a question now from Zhang Erjin. What are the US's red lines when it comes to China?
That's a very good question. I think the reason why you cannot answer that question is because the United States has not formulated a long-term strategy on how to manage China. And I say this with great confidence because my source for this is America's greatest living, I guess, statesman or thinker, who's Henry Kissinger. And I mentioned in my book, I had a one-on-one lunch with him in March 2018 in New York. And at the end of the lunch, I was trying to digest what he said to me. And then I said, well, he's obviously trying to tell me the US doesn't have a strategy. So I wrote him a note that said, can I cite you in my book saying US doesn't have a strategy? He said, yes, okay. So in my book, I say, and this is why there are no clear red lines. Because I actually think, and this is what I've argued in an essay that I published in National Interest in 2-3 months ago, saying that the United States should work out a long-term strategy. And actually, it is possible for the American people, who, by the way, the sad part about the United States is that it's the only developed country where the average incomes of the bottom 50% have stagnated for 30 years. And the United States is the only major developed country where life expectancy has come down. Everywhere else in the world, like Singapore, life expectancy keeps going up. So if the United States focuses on improving the well-being of its people, and if China focuses on improving the well-being of its people, US and China can and should get along. And I try to convey that optimistic message. So I'm trying to say actually that if they did a brutal calculation of where their real interests lie, their real interests actually lie in cooperation and not in conflict or competition.
Okay. Thank you. So we'll turn to our audience now. The microphone's coming round. Please raise your hand if you've got a question and speak out.
Hello, my name is Karthik. I'm a global politics student in grade 11. My question is, what is something we can learn from China?
I can't hear you. If you can speak a bit louder.
Sure. My name is Karthik. I'm a global politics student in grade 11. My question is, what is something we can learn from China? How can other countries adapt to a world in which China is the hegemonic power?
What can we learn from China and how can we adapt to China?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think the one thing we can learn from China is that you can take a country where in 1980, the figures vary, like 80 to 90% of the people lived in poverty, okay? 80 to 90%. And today it's almost down to zero. China's poverty eradication program is the most impressive and most successful poverty eradication program in human history. It's a tremendous accomplishment. For me, poverty eradication is actually very important because actually I was born in poverty. You know, I know what it's like. I was put in a special feeding program when I was 6 years old. I didn't have a flush toilet. I've lived through all that. So I think eradicating poverty should be the number one moral imperative in the world. And China is the leading example of how it can be done and how we should learn lessons from China in that area. And in terms of how we adapt to China, I think it is a fact that whenever a new great power emerges, the world order has got to change and reorient itself, right? And the question is whether or not, to put it very simply, will China emerge as an angry dragon or a peaceful dragon? And we don't know the answer to that because it's what we do today that will determine whether China emerges as an angry dragon or as a peaceful dragon. I think both are possible, which is why my thesis is that we should try to work with China as it is rising and persuade China to accept the current Western rules-based order that is a gift from the West to the rest of the world. And fortunately, as of now, China actually loves the rules-based order because China has succeeded in developing so well in the last 30 years because the rules-based order has facilitated China's rise. So the World Trade Organization is responsible for China emerging as the world's number one trading power today. So it is not in China's interest to disrupt the rules-based order. But all this can work out if you work out an understanding with China. But if there's no understanding with China, and if there is growing tension and conflict, then it is possible that China could emerge as an angry dragon. Then I think the world will be a less comfortable place.
Thank you, Kishore. There's the question here, which I'll paraphrase a bit, because I think it follows up on what you said there. You mentioned that China has done well out of the rules-based system, and it's currently, let's say, number 2. But you've also mentioned that as soon as a superpower becomes number 1, it no longer benefits from those rules. So how does that figure into the future that we're seeing ahead of us?
That's a very good question. And, the implicit in Bill Clinton's message, that United States should strengthen the multilateral rules-based order that would then constrain the next number 1, which would be China, right? Implicit in the message also was another point that every loophole that United States creates in international law today is a loophole that China will walk through tomorrow. Okay. So it is in the interest of United States, therefore, to close all the loopholes today, prevent China from doing that. I'll give you a concrete example. The United States has not ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China has. But if China becomes number 1, they say, okay, the previous number 1 didn't ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I will withdraw my ratification. And you don't want China to do that. So the way you prevent China from doing that is United States should ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But of course, politically, I just want you to know this, politically, it's impossible in the US Senate and Congress to achieve that. So in many ways, United States is acting against its own interests when it creates all these loopholes for China. But the question is, will China demolish the rules-based order when it becomes number one? And in my book, I argue that it is not likely to do so for one, actually important cultural reasons. For the Chinese, having order is very important, because the history of China has taught the Chinese people that whenever there's disorder under the heavens, people suffer. So the best thing to have is order, stability, predictability, which is why, by the way, the Chinese, according to the Harvard Kennedy School study, support for the Chinese Communist Party has gone up from 86% in 2003 to 93% in 2016. Why? Because the Chinese Communist Party has been delivering order, stability, predictability. So when China becomes number one, and if China becomes a much bigger global trader by then it is in China's interest to preserve the order and stability, not just inside China, but around China also. And so I actually think we can persuade China to continue to abide by the rules-based order, but you got to do that now, before it becomes number one, and not wait till it becomes number one to say, hey, why didn't you keep the rules-based order?
Okay, thank you for that extremely insightful answer. Karma, as a long-term student of China and having worked there, what's your take on that from a cultural perspective in relation to what Kishore just said?
So I agree very much with what Kishore said, that one of the key fears, I think, for the Communist Party in particular in China in recent years has been that idea of disorder and luan in the system. And when you look at some of the pronouncements and some of the work that has been done to verify the legitimacy of the party. So the Communist Party is 100 years old this year, and there's been a lot of the pronouncements and the propaganda around the Communist Party and what it has done for ordinary people in China is undoubtedly, it is important to remember, where 30 years ago China was, and as you said, that eradication of poverty. So as China's moved through various sort of political movements, first of all, the moderately prosperous society, so dealing with, people moving up the sort of hierarchy of economic wealth, now dealing with those continuing to deal with those at the bottom of the economy as well. I think that's so very important to maintain that legitimacy of the party. So with the party in control, staying in control, growing popularity, continuing to remind people of its roots, which was with the common man and bringing the bottom rung out of poverty. So very, very important to avoid that disorder as well, because the biggest fear, I would imagine, I don't know, I don't have that sort of listening device, but I would imagine one of the biggest fears for the party in China is that for those who are disaffected by what's happened in China, that generally speaking, the causes of that disaffection have been for different reasons. And traditionally, those who've been disaffected haven't sought common cause either. That must be a fear, that at any time there's a single common cause for those who are disaffected for human rights reasons, or who worry about the impact of the state on on so many areas of life. That if people sought common cause to sort of create disorder as well. So I think that that is a significant thing, that it's something significant that West should be aware of as a means to continue to engage with China as well. I do think what you said about doing that now, before China becomes the the dominant number one economy in the world, is important too. So there's a great sort of sense, I think, that that sort of blowback against Western interests in China, that can't be to the detriment of actually learning from the West's mistakes as well, in order to help China develop in a more, perhaps a less aggressive way, and to prevent that sort of aggression coming through. So I think it's all to play for at the moment, very much, in how we engage with China. I worry that many Western nations in particular don't have embedded the literacy about China, how to engage with China, a sort of common language about some of the issues in the public service, in our politicians and so on. And I think that's where Singapore could play a fantastic role, again, in bridging that gap. If you don't have enough people who know what good engagement looks like and what the language to use is, what the sort of levers are, then you've got a problem, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to our audience now. I can see some hands up. Can you pass the mic over? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Amber, a grade 11 global politics student, and I have a two-part question. If the United States were to shift their stance on the One China policy and a war broke out, particularly nuclear war, between the three main actors, China, the US, and Taiwan, then to what extent would this become a global disaster affecting perhaps allied states? And to what extent do you sincerely believe education could play a role in ensuring peace and deterring a fate like this?
I didn't get the last part. I heard the first part of the question. The last part, to what extent will the deterrence, sir?
So, to what extent would this be a global disaster affecting allied states as well? And what extent would education play a role in deterring this from happening?
Oh. By the way, none of us know what's going to happen when a nuclear war breaks out. Let's be very clear about that. I mean, you've heard the phrase nuclear winter, right? We have no idea at all. I mean, actually, what's crazy about humanity, in theory, we are the most intelligent species on planet Earth. But we are so intelligent that we have developed the capability to kill humanity several times over. There's absolutely no reason for the United States to have still 6,000 nuclear weapons, Russia to have 5,000 nuclear weapons, China, for some strange reason, still has only 300. There's something strange about the Chinese. But if you add up all the nuclear weapons in the world, they can kill humanity several times over. We don't need them, but we have them. And if they're unleashed, then no one knows the consequences. Fortunately, most people understand that a nuclear war should be avoided, okay? Except, as I said briefly, in the last 10 months of the Trump administration, when something went wrong with the policy making, when people like Mike Pompeo didn't understand that he could have started a nuclear war. So first thing we need to do is and I think this is something your generation should do. You should study every possible conflict that can start a nuclear war. So I can mention what they are for a start. I mean, Taiwan is number one, right? I would say Korea is number two, because North Korea has nuclear weapons. So that can start a nuclear war. I would say maybe Russia and Ukraine could start a nuclear war, because Russia has got a tremendous number of nuclear weapons. So let's go to the conflicts where you can start a nuclear war and then analyze what you do to prevent them from happening. And I don't think we spend enough time doing that, because we become very lazy and complacent. I remember during the Cold War, there was a lot of concern about nuclear war starting. So there was a lot of attention to it, but we've stopped paying attention to it. Now I think we got to swing back to it, because if once it starts, let's I give you a sort of hypothetical example. Let's say United States flies in troops to defend Taiwan after Taiwan declares independence, whatever it is, right? China reacts and launches missiles to kill American troops in Taiwan. American troops are killed by Chinese missiles. United States, okay, I'll teach you a lesson. So they start to bomb, let's say, Guangzhou. Send a nuclear bomb to Guangzhou. China has to respond. San Francisco gets hit by a nuclear strike. See how it goes? One. And before you know it, you end up with several cities, right? And I'm actually quite shocked that no one prepares for this. You're mad. It can destroy the world. But you take that small step and you think, okay, I am just sending some troops in to defend the freedom of the Taiwanese. But you got to understand, when you do that, you're taking the first step towards, an inevitable slide that will result in the first nuclear weapon being used. Now, that's the kind of analysis you need to do to understand how nuclear wars start. And nobody does it. I want to emphasize this. Nobody does it. Just crazy. That's what we should be paying attention to. And that's why the subject of peace is so important. Because you cannot assume that it will not happen. I suspect it won't happen in my lifetime, so I'm safe. But I'm not so sure about your lifetime. It's more likely to happen in your lifetime than in my lifetime. So you've got to focus on this nuclear issue and surface it and discuss it to ensure that everyone understands, these are the red lines, let's not get near them.
Yeah. Maybe if I could just add as well, I think that when you asked, Anna, I think you asked about the role that education can play. And I think, United World Colleges around the world and, with our mission for peace and a sustainable future, ultimately, sustainable future is all about, deconflicting and creating situations that make peace and maintain peace. And I think, in education, in a school, it's as simple as making sure, for example, we talked a bit before about the rules-based international system, making sure that, what might seem like ancient history and, or recent history, but around those institutions that were created to, you talked about nuclear, possibility of nuclear war, the institutions like the International Atomic Energy Agency and so on, which have been quite diminished in their funding and power over the last few years, that is part of the history of what was created after bombs were dropped on Japan in order to contain those things from ever happening again. So making sure that in our education, that for those who are interested in pursuing the initiative for peace or global politics and so on, that history is front and center as being as current today as it ever was, because we really need to validate those agencies and strengthen them, because they are so important. As you said, the charters of those institutions are what we need to refer back to as well. I think that's so important that we've got young people who want to be able to look at these things as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you addressed the education dimension, which I failed to do so, which is why I also launched the Asian Peace Program at the National University of Singapore, to try and see what we can do to avoid these worst-case scenarios. And I'm glad that the Asian Peace Program will be collaborating with the United World College Southeast Asia. So I hope you'll all participate in that collaboration too.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for a few more questions.
My name is Lynn. I'm a grade 12 global politics student. About Southeast Asia, I believe that it has a really huge geopolitical significance. So in terms of relationship between the US and China, how do these two superpowers approach this region politically, and what role can Southeast Asia play in order to promote peace and keep the war at bay?
Yeah. So your question is, what are the attitudes of US and China towards Southeast Asia, and what can Southeast Asia do to preserve peace?
Yes.
Well, I think Southeast Asia has a very important role to play, frankly, because I think, and when I talk about Southeast Asia, especially ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, because it's very important for the ASEAN countries to make the point that this growing contest between US and China is not just going to disrupt lives in the United States, disrupt lives in China. I mean, and by disruption, I don't mean necessarily war. No? Even without war, there'll be disruption. I mean, for example, farmers in the United States lost their incomes when China retaliated against American trade tariffs. Farmers in America got less money, and then the US Congress had to give farmers money. So these are examples of disruptions. So if the disruptions are going to be confined to United States and China, then they can keep on doing whatever they're doing. Unfortunately, if the United States and China, when they launch a trade war, it doesn't affect these two countries. It affects the global economy. It affects the lives of people around the world. It affects lives of people in Southeast Asia too. So that's why it's important for Southeast Asians to say, please, why don't you just press the pause button on this geopolitical contest? Because frankly, we have more important issues to address. Number one, in the short term, we still haven't overcome COVID-19. So let's come together and kill COVID-19 first. I mean, the fact you're all wearing masks, and the only reason why Karma and I are not wearing masks because I did the antigen test, okay? So I'm confident I don't have COVID-19. And at the same time, and there's one subject I'm actually surprised we haven't raised at all, which is climate change. And another great moral imperative of our times is to fight climate change. And there is no way you can fight climate change unless the United States and China cooperate. Because if United States and China don't cooperate, forget it. We lost the battle already against climate change. Because these are the two largest emitters in the world, right? So that's another reason why we in Southeast Asia, I argue, should speak out more loudly. The trouble is that Southeast Asians, the problem with Southeast Asians, they're very nice people, they're very polite people. And polite people never speak unpleasant truths to others. So my mission in life is to persuade Southeast Asians to become as rude as me and to speak out more loudly and clearly and frankly to the United States and China and say, stop this stupid game, stop this contest, let's focus on the common challenges we face.
That's a challenge
you,
for
Kishore.
Lynn.
Yeah.
I think Lynn's going to take that one forward.
I think we've got time for one more question. We're a bit short of time. I'll ask you to be brief, please. One more question, one final question.
Hi, I'm Ryan, a grade 11 global politics student. My question is, should countries like the US look past human rights violations in Xinjiang or Hong Kong in order to maintain peace?
Well, that's a very good question. The question is, do you want to reduce the human rights violations in Xinjiang, or do you want to make political capital out of the human rights violations in Xinjiang? So your goal is very, very clear. If you want to make political capital out of the human rights violations in Xinjiang, raise it publicly, make a lot of public noise, and you know it will make no difference at all. Most countries in the world never accept public embarrassment. So it will not improve and will not change the human rights violations in Xinjiang at all, zero impact. But I can tell you, as someone who was in diplomacy for 33 years, if you want to change a country's behavior, do it quietly, don't raise it publicly, don't embarrass them publicly, talk to them and quietly, and then you'll find to your surprise that things can change and things can improve. It takes time, but it can be done. So the moral choice you have is, do you want to do good or do you want to feel good? If you want to feel good, yes, raise the human rights violations publicly, make a big deal, sound very heroic and all that, you make no difference at all. But if you want to do good and make a difference, then you don't raise it publicly, raise it quietly, privately, and see, why don't we try and find something about this? So my advice is, the best way to do these things is to do them quietly, and then you'll find over time things will change and improve.
And Kishore, do you think enough of our politicians are actually raising these things quietly with China?
Sorry?
Do you think enough of our diplomats or our politicians are actually raising these things quietly?
I think to some extent it's happening. I mean, for example, the interesting thing is one of the most uncomfortable statistics I give in my book is that China is accused of interning 800,000 civilians in Xinjiang. I mean, that's the public allegations that are made. But United States has actually, I mean, this is from Brown University, 800,000 Muslims have been killed in wars in the last 20 years. This is from Brown University Watson Institute. So if you look between the internment of 800,000 Muslim civilians and the killing of 800,000 Muslim civilians, I would say the killing of civilians is a far greater human rights violation than internment of Muslim civilians. But the question, therefore, is when you talk to the Muslims, right? The interesting question is this. There are 1.3 billion Muslims in the world. There are, I think, about 40 to 50, I don't have the exact number, Muslim countries in the world. But when the West decided to pass a human rights resolution on Xinjiang in the UN Commission on Human Rights, right? Not one Muslim state supported it. Now, I think that was a very clear sign, right, that the Muslim states saw that this is just clearly a propaganda weapon that was being used against China, and they didn't want to participate in it. But if the West can work with the Muslim states and then talk to China privately, that's far more effective than to go and try and attack them publicly. So I would say the answer is, if you're concerned about the Muslims in China, get the Muslims on your side.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore, and thank you for the sort of stirring call to think about action that makes an effect, not just creates a noise. I think that's a really powerful point for all our global politics students. I'm going to wrap it up now because there's a million questions we could ask, and I'm sorry we haven't got to everybody's questions either online or from the audience. But I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes if you'd like to make any closing remarks, just to say from what you've heard, maybe what would your advice be to young people watching today as the thought to leave them with?
Over to you.
Well, I mean, the one thing I would like to emphasize is that one great hope the world has is the idealism of the young. And I can tell you, as someone who's, I suspect I'm far older than anybody here, as someone who's 73 years old, you see a life cycle, okay? You start off very idealistic. Then you start working, struggling, trying to make a living, supporting your family, and gradually you become more and more pragmatic, and you forget your ideals, right? The challenge as you get older is to actually remember your ideals, but then find pragmatic ways of applying them and making sure you get results that work. And that's a real challenge. Because it's easy to be idealistic, to give speeches, to sound good, to feel good, have no impact. There's no point being idealistic and having no impact. The real people who really make a difference in the world, Kofi Annan is an example. He's very idealistic, but he also knew when to push, when not to push, how to change countries' behaviors. He did that very carefully, artfully. And he often did it quietly, behind the scenes, without embarrassing countries, and then he would quietly get changes accomplished. So he actually deserved the Nobel Peace Prize that he got, Kofi Annan. So that's the kind of, person you need to become, someone who remains idealistic, but yet can get concrete results in a very difficult, messy world.
I would just say, this is a fantastic college, and with a fantastic mission. This is 50 years we're celebrating the mission that's still our compass and our North Star. So picking up on your idea of idealism, I think the mission is very idealistic, but 50